Next, we'll get out of the graph mode by using Shift F3 or simply clicking on the icon. We'll also close up the expressions for our light flare and focus on the water that should be quickly rising behind our control panel. In order to see the entire composition a little better, we'll use Alt// or Option/ on the Mac so that it fills the screen. Next, I'll deselect the light flare and reveal all of the shied layers. What I want to do is create a shape layer, and with none of the layers selected, I'll click on the rectangular marquee tool and create a very simple rectangle shape. Now, it doesn't matter what color it is. We know that we can change the color after we draw it, and this time I'm going to create a blue fill with a large white border. To the shape layer, we'll add a simple gradient. So from the Switches and Modes column, I'll click and add a gradient fill. Currently, the gradient fill goes from left to right. I want to change that so that it goes from the top to the bottom. So I'll use the V key to get the selection tool. Now I can move both the start and the end of the gradient. I'll also want to change this gradient fill from normal to overlay. We'll add a couple more effectors, so from Add, we'll choose Wiggle Paths. Under the parameters for Wiggle Paths, we'll set a keyframe. So at frame 0, our temporal phase will be 0. Then at the last frame of the animation, our temporal phase will be 1. We'll increase the size of our wiggled paths and close this up. Next, we'll add another effector, this time rounding the corners of the wiggles that we've made. The last thing we want to do is make sure that our rectangle path is squarely in the middle of our composition. So here, we'll make sure that the position of our path is at 0 and 0. For the transformation of our rectangle, we'll also make sure that the position is at 0 and 0. For now, I'll change the stroke width from 17 down to 4. With just a handful of values added to our shape layer, it can be difficult to get in and animate all of these together, especially if we just want to copy and paste one value to another. Of course, we can use an expression to link several parameters to another parameter, but we would still need to open up the contents of our shape layer to get to the keyframes. There's an easier way to do this, which will allow us to control the parameters of our shape layer without ever having to open the contents of the layer. We'll go to frame 0, and at frame 0, with the layer selected, we'll go up to Effect and go down to the Expression Controls group. The Expression Controls effects are controls that can modify variables found in expressions. An angle checkbox might control the revolutions and degrees of a certain parameter. A checkbox control might be an on and off toggle. Color control would be a color picker. A layer control would select a certain layer from any layer in a composition. The point control would be an XY coordinate. And finally, the slider control, which would generate a number. We'll use a slider control so that we can control the height of our rectangular shape. Now you can see in the effect for this layer, we have one effect called slider control, and within that, there is a single parameter called slider. We'll go down to our rectangular path in the timeline and change the size using an expression. So again, we'll use the Alt key or the Option key on your Mac, then click on the stopwatch, and now we'll click and link up to the slider value in our expression. Once we release this, we can see that we have an expression that has a variable and an array. The array is the x value and the y value for the size of the rectangle. Now we do want to control the height, which is the y value, with our slider. But the x value, the first value in our array, should remain a constant 850 pixels. This is easy to change by simply adding the number here and then pressing Enter on the number pad. Now as we click and drag the slider, we can see that we're changing the value for the size of our layer by simply clicking and dragging the slider command. There's no need to come down into the contents of our shape layer in order to modify this. Additionally, we can set keyframes by simply clicking on the stopwatch here in the Effect controls rather than opening the parameters down inside the layer. Here we'll set a keyframe at frame 0 for a value of 0. At about 3.5 seconds, we'll set a value for the slider for 600 pixels. Now we can see that the animation has been set on the effect so that when the slider moves, the size of our rectangular path will change also. Currently, our effect is called slider control. We know that we can change the name of an effect by simply clicking on the word in our effects control panel, then using Enter or Return on the keyboard and changing the name. We'll call this water height and use Enter to accept the name. In the JavaScript, it's telling us that there is a slider in the effect called water height, which describes the variable called temp. As we scrub the timeline now to reveal our animation, we can see our gradient fill. As the water rises, the gradient fill doesn't change. Clicking and scrubbing in the timeline shows that the start and the end point for our gradient fill stays in exactly the same position. What we want to do is modify this so that the start of the gradient fill starts at the top of the water level. We'll close up the rectangle path parameters, then take a look at our gradient fill. Here we have our start point. By Alt-clicking or Option-clicking on the Mac, we can set up our expression. What we want to do is use the same value that describes the height of the rectangle. So we'll click and drag up to the slider and click Enter to accept this. Let's open this up a bit so we can see what's going on here. Our start point now has a position value of 300 on the X and 300 on the Y from its 0, 0 coordinate. What this means is that it's now 300 pixels to the right and 300 pixels down from where it originally started on the shape layer's transformation value. This isn't what I want. Instead, we want the X value to remain 0. So we'll modify the expression by typing 0 in the first position of the array. Now our start layer of our gradient fill is in the center, but it's going down when we want it to go up. So again, we'll need to add some simple math. I'll modify the expression, enclosing the variable, then multiplying it by a -1. Now we can see the start point of our gradient fill moving, but it's moving at twice the speed that we need it to. The water's height describes the width between the top and the bottom of our water. However, the start point is described by where it began and the value that it approaches. What's happening now is we're getting a value that's returning twice the amount that we need. So what we need to do is enclose this entire value with parentheses, then divide it by 1/2. If you enter this incorrectly, After Effects will give you a syntax error again. So make sure that the syntax is correct in every part of your expression. Now we see that the water height is described by the slider, and the start point of our gradient is also described by the slider, but we're using half of its negative value, so when the slider moves 300 pixels, the start of the gradient only moves half as much. We'll start by closing up some of these parameters so we can composite all of these elements together. Our shape layer for the water can go just down below the backplate. Our knob and the levels can be composited in an overlay mode so they fit within the meters of the graphics. We'll turn on the visibility for the green so we can see that as well. And now we see that the green needs to be adjusted so the X value remains constant. By typing EE on the keyboard, I'll open up the expression for the scale. Here I'll change my X value in order to keep this part of the array at 100. Make sure you only choose the word temp. Press Enter on the number pad to accept the value. Then we'll turn off the visibility for level red 2 and turn on the visibility for level red. On this level, we'll simply take the expression off by holding down the Alt key, then clicking on the stopwatch for scale. We'll change the scale value to 100%. We'll close these up and change our shape layer, the water, to a different transfer mode. Let's use hard light.